I'm doing this one on YouTube and not Facebook Live because being able to be concise about this one is extremely important. Imagine a society where there was 95% consent for everyone, except of course the people who were in control of the consent amount. So, in this society where there's 95% consent, that means that on the outskirts of this society, there is 100% consent. But where this society is organized at, where this society works, there is 95% consent. So that means that 5% of the interactions that occur in this circle, in this society, are non-consensual. Now, the reason that I'm focusing here on 5% consent is that there are two things that go with this. One of those things is that there is a sheer amount of power to being able to take or have a lot of money or a lot of power. Now, when people talk about voting for Trump or voting for Hillary, this is the kind of thing they're talking about. Now, when you've accepted the idea that some amount of non-consensual interactions are mandatory for doing society, you see, for example, the free market as being a function of government. Namely, the free market and corporations are one and the same, conceptually speaking. And you may or may not realize this. Some people do, some people don't. This means that you view the idea of the free market as being fundamentally and inherently incoherent. Likewise, consent itself is a socially constructed type of thing. And then we come into here in the realm of manufactured consent. Now, our current society has a variety of tax rates to it. For some people it's around 50%, for some people it's around 17%, for some people it's around 10% or 7% or something like that. And then likewise with the corporations there are tax breaks. Now I'm bringing this up for a reason. The Tea Party was about a 4% tea tax. And the Founding Fathers were running from what? A tyrannical king. The key contention and the key question here is whether it is possible to have a sustainable, somewhat non-consensual society. And by that I mean something like 99% consensual, and then there's 1% that's non-consensual, or 95% consensual, and then 5% non-consensual. Because the basic issue with the ignoring of consent, with things being non-consensual, is there is no accountability measure. And how this relates to cancer is that the essential function of cancer is that it has forgotten the proper function of itself as a cell, and it's focused on growth and survival. Another thing that this taps into is fractional consent. When you're being raped, for instance, this can have a number of situations to it. One of them is that you were kind of into it, and then you weren't, but you kept going anyways, and you weren't very happy about the end result. Well, it's your responsibility to say no. That's buyer's remorse and not standing up for yourself. When someone is having sex with you and you are actively saying no to it and that you don't want it, that's rape. That is, without regard to your consent. But that is a full experience of lack of consent, as compared with, say, 5%. The reason and idea that the assumption is that you can't have society, that you can't have universal agreement, is because this is the main way that people are assuming how society works. That society works with the lack of consent, with a certain amount of the lack of consent. And a society without consent all the way, all the time, is an unsustainable society, which is why it looks to most people like it's just simply impossible to agree on anything, at least in a universal and deep way. The reason for that is the assumption of any amount of the necessity of the lack of consent, even 5%, even 1%. To include a lack of consent in regards to interactions inculcates and necessitates and brings about and ensures unaccountability, inherently. If you reverse the circle and situation a little bit, it becomes pretty clear as to why 5% can be such a huge issue. And likewise, why 100% consent is completely key and essential. If you want to eliminate poverty, eliminate the cause of poverty. Poverty is caused by the systematic disregard of consent. So let's talk about power for a moment, because that's what we're talking about here, is the power, the money, the influence of being able to just take money without regard for anything, without regard for consent, without regard to accountability. So for every dollar that 3 trillion people make or 6 billion people make, that's either 30, 100,000 million, 30 million, or 60,000. And I'm just saying people here, in other words, you can just say a dollar. For every dollar you make, this is what's going into the government. And yes, this isn't exact in any sense of the term. Based on the idea of 5% taxation and that's all that's happening, this is the amount that's going to government. So when you're talking about the issues with government and how it sucks and how it's not that great, but we can always do better, and the reason why it seems like it is perpetually impossible to have agreement, it is because you are systematically destroying the world by saying, well, 5% consent is kind of a 5% lack of consent is a necessity thing for having a society. I mean, yeah, it sucks, it's not consensual, but how would you have roads? How would you have healthcare? How would you have schools? And it's because of that lack of consent, that 5% or whatever lack of consent, that schools are places generally of indoctrination, that roads need perpetual amounts of work, that government healthcare is infamous for sucking. And why? Because there's a lot of money and power that is completely and utterly unaccountable. Why? Because this cancer sucks, but how can we organize society better with a better type of government system without resorting to anarchy, without resorting to chaos? So in other words, what you're asking for is how to get rid of a cancerous tumor while leaving the cancerous tumor in place. Don't! Get rid of it! This core net is why the assumption is that government is society, that organization is a form of government, that it's impossible to get people to agree on things because this is the basic assumption set. This is how society works, and this is how society will always work. This is an impossible utopian ideal, anarchy, where 100% of interactions are systematically consensual. This isn't an argument about we won't have murder, we won't have rape. This is an argument that let's not have murder and rape be part of our standard way of organizing ourselves. This is an argument for consistency of principle and how it can lead to a greatly much more prosperous, by scopes and bounds, society.